Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of the Ways and Means Committee. John Quincy, Chair of the committee, joined by Council members Bender, Palmisano, and Yang, and we are a quorum of the committee, so we can go ahead and begin. We have a number of items on our agenda today, and so I'm going to start with the consent agenda, which has 29 items on it. And it begins with the city attorney's office brings forward three legal settlements. Two are workers' compensation claims and one auto insurance subrogation. From the city coordinator, we have two travel-related donations, acceptance of gifts to attend two different conventions or conferences. The convention center brings forward one item today. It's the Target Center renovation project. This does not affect, obviously, the budget or any of the plans. This is authorizing delegation of authority to a project manager, as well as appointment of the city finance officer, Mark Ruff, our chief finance officer, to the Target Center Arena Design Group as a replacement for our former CFO, Kevin Carpenter. Finance and Property Services brings forward four items today, one of which is on the consent agenda. It's a contract for criminal background investigation services for contractors. The Human Resources Department has two items. It's a contract amendment with Sue Plaster Consulting for EEO reporting and workforce planning, and a contract with Deloitte Consulting for benefit consultation services. Also been joined by Council Vice President Glidden, and I neglected to mention that we won't be joined by Councilmember Johnson today as he is still on his honeymoon. So we wish him the best and look forward to his return. The Community Development and Regulatory Services Committee brings forward three items. One is the 2016 Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS funding awards, the travel donation acceptance for the Director of Employment and Training to attend an event in New York City. And then item number 12 is the 2015 Financial Status Report on CPED development programs. Two items that were referred to us from the Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee. One is the Influenza Immunization Clinic Agreement with Hennepin Health, and then a grant application to Minnesota Department of Health for maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting. The Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee referred six items to us. First is a grant acceptance from the United States Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant. We also have a contract with the Minnesota Timberwolves for bomb detection security services at Target Center, contract with Minnesota Internet Crimes Against Children's Task Force, contract with Minnesota Crisis Intervention Teams Officers Association for Police Mental Health Crisis Response Training, a grant acceptance from the Minneapolis Foundation for EMS Pathways Academy, and a joint powers agreement with the state of Minnesota to participate in the disparity study. The Transportation and Public Works Committee brings forward 9 items. First is a 2016 alley renovation program, a contract with Hennepin Technical College for test creation and scoring services, a contract with Ritchie Brothers Auctioneers for auction services, contract with Furpal Construction USA for water main reconstruction. Item number 25 is an agreement for paid advertising with the municipal parking system. We have the 37th Avenue Northeast Regional Solicitation Application Cooperative Agreement. We have a contract with CDM Smith Inc. for tunnel layout design, a bid for stormwater pump station rehabilitation project, and a bid for self-propelled paint striper. And that concludes the 29 consent items. Are there any questions or comments from committee members on that? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Those items are all passed and can go on. So happy day. The next 3 items are on our discussion agenda. They're all related to the Finance and Property Services Department. So I thought I might invite Mr. Ruff up if he could describe what's in front of us as kind of a package, and then we'll take each item up individually after that. Mr. Ruff, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Mark Ruff, the Chief Financial Officer for the city.
We do have 3 items from our department. They were not intentionally put on this agenda together, but they follow the same theme, and so we thought it might be appropriate just to talk generally about what those themes are. Number 1 is interest rates continue to be very low and affordable for public bodies such as the city of Minneapolis with very strong bond ratings. We, as the city, having predominantly AAA ratings for the city, we get the lowest possible ratings. We do have several bond issues that our staff has been monitoring for either refunding, which is another word for refinancing to lower interest rates, or just to simply prepay early and use some of our reserves to undertake that prepayment. So we will have Mr. Mike Ablin give a more thorough explanation of that. But again, unfortunately, the bad economic news is good news for the city from the standpoint of lower interest rates over a period of time. The second item is related to just how we administer construction contracts and changes that occur on the job as those construction contracts are implemented. We have worked closely with Public Works, and we'll have a more thorough discussion, just putting some boundaries around what type of change orders are appropriate and what are considered to be significant or not significant change orders. And then the last is a major issue for the city to embark upon, and this is space planning needs. That has been a decades-long process here at the city, and Mr. Greg Oakey is going to go through history. We certainly have a number of people here also to answer questions about not just the history, but going forward. But certainly are excited about this opportunity that all 3 of these items bring, especially item 32, where we will be asking for some significant City Council input over the next several months. So with that, be happy to turn it over to Mr. Ablin unless there's other issues.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Not seeing anything. Mr. Ablin, welcome. It's always good to see the debt guy, especially on some good news stories. So
good afternoon, Chair Quincy and members of the committee. I get to do one of my favorite presentations. It's short and is full of good news. So I'm just going to talk about the 5 series of bonds that are in the letter that's before you for authorization to do refundings of these bonds and or prepayments. So there's 2 tax increment series of bonds that are up for refunding. The first one is related to the Midtown Exchange project, the taxable Block E project, and those bonds became callable on March 1 of 16. At that time, we had some cash on hand, so we were able to put in a call notice and prepay $3,975,000 of the longest dated maturities. That saved the city $1,812,000 and change in future interest, and left $2.5 million left to be refunded. So at this point in time, we're planning a refunding of those $2.5 million remaining bonds. We've got some estimates that the savings from that could result in like $254,000. We also may prepay these bonds depending on what our revenues are looking at later this year. So we'll either prepay these or refund these. The next series is the Midtown Exchange project. That series of bonds had $2,245,000 left in callable mode on 3/1/16. Again, we had some excess resources on hand, so in May we prepaid $1,250,000 of that. Again, the longest maturities is what we usually like to prepay because they're usually at the highest rates. So that saved $816,000 in future interest and leaves us with $995,000 to refund, and we estimate a savings of about $147,000 there, as well as improving our debt service coverage, which will help the city have a good coverage on our debt. And that coverage is basically how much revenue you bring in versus what your debt service commitments are. Finally, the 3 general obligation series that are not tax, well, one of them is tax increment related, but I'll talk about that. We have 3 other general obligation various purpose bonds. The large one has $29,450,000 that will become callable on December 1st. Those bonds will generate savings of about close to $4.5 million when we refund them. If you look in your packet, you'll see the interest rates on these bonds are in the 4% range, and we should be able to issue those at something less than half of that. So as a proxy for where that savings comes from. The other series is the 2009 B bonds, where we have $4,440,000 that we can refund. We estimate saving about $544,000 there. And finally, we have the St. Thomas ramp, which has $4,000,001 that's callable. And if we refund those, we'll save $758,000. And we may have an option here to prepay. If we were able to prepay these bonds, we'd actually save about $1 million, almost $1.2 million. So depending on the position of the parking fund, as we get closer to this, we may make decisions that might allow us to prepay. So in total, if we just refunded them like I've suggested here, we could be looking at $6,192,000 and change of interest savings over time that we are basically not going to incur. So that's quite a nice savings. And if we are able to prepay, that number would actually go up. So that's what we're seeking your authority to let us plan for and go forth with those refundings and save the city some money.
Well, it's very good news, obviously. Very excited about the opportunity to avoid $6 million plus in interest fee. It's not like we can save it and bank it and spend it someplace else. This is just avoiding, so just making a good financial decision. What would be the cash positions that would allow us to do that? Are we in a good position to do that, or likelihood, or what's the timing of that?
In the case of the parking fund and other enterprise funds, we typically have a stipulated cash balance that we like to keep on hand for operations. It's 3 months of operations. And currently we are in excess of that. So it'll depend on other programs that are currently occurring and needs for capital funds, et cetera, and profitability between now and, let's say, toward the end of August. And then we'll take another peek. And if we feel we can prepay them, we will do that. If it looks like there's other needs on the fund, then we may just go this route and save the dollars by refunding the debt.
Are all of these debt issuances, are they related to specific funds, or are they part of a general fund? Are they enterprise funds, or?
Mr. Chair, the various purpose bonds have, as they say, there's sewer and water and special assessments and net debt bonds, so they're not necessarily specific to a given project. They're sort of for the capital program. But the St. Thomas ramp is one for one. It is financing on that particular ramp, as is the Block E project and the Midtown Exchange. So they're very, related to a specific business purpose and a funding source.
Very good. Are there any other questions? I see Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ablin, I'm just curious what, a fairly broad question, but what puts us in this very favorable cash position? Clearly, we didn't originally think that we would be in this cash position now on this series of projects, or we'd have negotiated different terms for those way back at the beginning. So could you just give a really general sense of what puts us in this cash position now?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, in the case of the tax increment bonds, when you start out on the road to financing with tax increment, you have projections of property values and what kind of increment that will bring in. As the real estate market has recovered very strongly in Minneapolis, we're starting to receive larger dollars coming in from that source than was originally anticipated. So those dollars are generating excess increment that can then be used to pay down this debt. And it's kind of the same with the parking fund. The parking fund has been doing very good financially. The meters around town have helped to increase the profitability of the parking fund, and that's giving us, maybe some possibilities that we can take those dollars and prepay some debt. Okay.
Thank you. And I think the bulk of it was also when we took out the loans, they were at a 4% plus rate, and now we'll be able to save it at 2%. So significant work. Thanks very much, Mr. Ablin, for watching this. For this item, what we're looking for is authorization to issue geo tax increment and various purpose refunding bonds. So all those in favor of that item, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed? Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Ablin. Are you also dealing with the next item, or Mr. Ruff handling that? Mr. Goki or Mr. Ruff? Item number 32 for those.
Mr. Chair, members of the
31,
committee,
sorry.
Mark Ruff. This item is formalizing, which has been largely informal practices on construction projects, and at what point in time change orders trigger reviews by different areas of the city. And what I mean by different areas of the city, it would be at what level of a supervisor is necessary to sign off on that change order. And that moves all the way up through department heads and ultimately to the city council and mayor. And so the methodology that is proposed in front of you for this policy change has been used on other major projects in the city on a case-by-case basis, and we are looking to make this more universal across the city. And so there are 3 different levels of change orders. In other words, just change order being a surprise that occurs usually in the middle of a construction contract. And there is some sensitivity, obviously, if it's a street projects. In the past, there's been some need sometimes to just hold work until we can get oftentimes even city council approval, which may take 2 or 3 weeks. And so this is an effort of making sure, number one, that smaller change orders can be taken care of really the next day as long as the appropriate steps are taken. 2 is that there is a sign off not just within the department but also outside the department, which if it's over 50,000 would require review by civil rights and certainly requires an amendment created and approved by the city attorney's office. And so the different levels really are the under 15,000, the 15 to 50,000, and the more than 50,000, with always an understanding of, number one, the project needs to have contingency or funding sources for any of those change items. And so it can't be something that is an unforeseen amount that bumps the total amount of the project. And if it does go over the total amount of the project, then it would need to come back to city council. So if it's eliminated the project contingency that would have been in that budget. 2 is anything over 100,000 still needs to come back to city council, or 5% of the project budget. This was drafted, as I mentioned, in concert, especially with Public Works, where the majority of construction projects occur, but not universally. It also has the blessing of the city attorney's office. Gary Winter, who is in charge of the procurement area, has been deeply involved in this policy, and I certainly would recommend that the committee approve it, but happy to answer questions. We have experts here, both Greg Oki and Chris Backus from Property Services, who deal with this on a daily basis, and be happy to answer any questions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Ruff. Are there any questions for Mr. Ruff? Good. Not seeing any. I do want to highlight, I think this is a good way to operate, provide some flexibility without a constraint of the government process, but I don't think it supersedes our oversight responsibilities. One of the concerns I had expressed to Mr. Ruff earlier is I certainly didn't want to see this as part of a new way of doing things in our procurement department, where they would take a low bid and then only to find a significant number of change orders after a process that would have been unrealistic if we would have taken that bid otherwise. So I thought it was important to highlight this as a policy change and worth noting. So not seeing any. All in approval, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That item carries. And Mr. Goki, I believe you are handling the next section, which is about the strategic real estate plan for downtown. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Quincy and committee members, I'm Greg Goki, Director of Property Services. I'm here today to update you on the progress made on our strategic real estate plan for the downtown campus. This is a follow-up to last year's council study session on facilities, and today I'm asking you to move forward approval on some key next steps in our process in moving forward on our strategic plan. For the benefit of the viewing audience, I'd like to touch on some strategic real estate milestones that may be of some interest. The first City Hall building was built in 1873 and was located at the gateway of Hennepin and Nicollet Avenues. By the mid-1880s, the building was deemed unsafe for employees that led to the eventual construction of the building we're in today, the Minneapolis City Hall, Hennepin County Courthouse. As many of you know, we'll be celebrating the 125th anniversary next month. At this time, the building featured modern office spaces and what was deemed a state-of-the-art communication center. The building was envisioned to meet the city and Hennepin County's growing space needs for 50 years. But by already in 1920, both the city and county were out of space and looking for options to meet their space needs. As reported in the Daily Star, a plan envisioned by Hennepin County Treasurer Henry Bofelli advocated the addition of 5 floors to our current building that would solve the urgent need for additional space and forestall any movement of a new City Hall Courthouse building. In 1957, the Public Health Center, now referred to as the Public Service Center, was constructed. The city eventually purchased the building for $1, and the building has had minimal capital improvements to date. By 1968, departments had outgrown their designated spaces so badly that support staff had to be placed in desks in the main corridors of the building. Planning efforts had also begun for the new Hennepin County Government Center. Early options included building large enough to meet the city's space needs as well. The eventual plan selected and built in 1974 provided additional space to meet the current county's future growth needs. This space was then leased to the city for a period of 15 years, ending in 1989. That same year, the City of Lakes was purchased from the state of Minnesota, and it was used to house city departments who had to relocate from the Hennepin County Government Center as the city's leases expired. Also in 1989, the city, through its now merged development agency, signed the original lease at the Crown Roller Mill Complex. In 1999, the Facility Space and Asset Management Committee is formed. The next year, the City Council directs staff to abandon plans to renovate the Public Service Center and to develop a long-term plan to meet the city's growing needs. In 2005, the FSAM Committee recommends a business center be created and the city continue to lease for its near-term needs. Which brings us to today. I will highlight efforts of the last 18 months and our recommendation moving forward. The FSAM Committee partnered with John Stiles, Council members Quincy, Goodman, and Fry to form an executive committee to evaluate and make recommendations on real estate options that are available to the city to meet our administrative needs in the downtown campus. In 2014, the council approved contracting with Jones Lang LaSalle to assist with real estate consulting and brokerage services. Jones Lang LaSalle led staff and elected officials through a diligent process that involved input from department heads and surveyed staff to identify unmet needs, desired outcomes, and a workplace strategy that would be evaluated with real estate costs and complexity. An initial set of intended outcomes were established that real estate options would be assessed by. Ultimately, improving our service to the public more effectively and efficiently is the return on our investment. When staff refers to the downtown campus, we are referring to a group of city-owned and leased facilities that are represented in this slide. For the foreseeable future, we will continue to recommend that certain functions remain or be relocated in City Hall. Outside of City Hall, which is currently under a rolling renovation, city buildings are functionally obsolete and will be costly to renovate and repair. Leased spaces are physically too far from City Hall and use space inefficiently and do not provide long-term strategic solutions or provide ease of access for residents and businesses to meet with city staff. The city does need to make significant real estate investment decisions soon. The Public Service Center, pursuant to council direction in 2000, has had minimal improvements to date. The City of Lakes, constructed in 1958, was purchased by the city in 1989. That building has had minimal improvements to date. We operate and occupy these buildings at high risk of building systems failure and disruption to vital public services. As we engaged department heads in the process, the consistent message was they believe the city's current fleet of buildings and leased spaces seriously impacted delivery of services to the public. They also conveyed a sense of urgency to do something, and that a do-nothing strategy is not an option to consider. Investment is needed, but the question becomes, is investment in our current buildings and continuing to lease without consolidation of space an effective use of our resources, both from a financial and human resource perspective? Department heads also displayed an open-mindedness as to what real estate solutions may be available. They are strongly committed to improving our services to the public, but they also conveyed a sense of urgency and excitement for what the future could be. Changing our internal culture was also widely supported. One of the challenges in the feedback from department heads is that City Hall really does not foster the top themes of improvement. The committee worked through a functional relationship and an adjacency exercise to determine which departments should be co-located, have embedded employees, and who can make the best use of City Hall with its historic nature and inherent limitations. These relationships vary in strength and can change over time with technology. Studying these relationships also supports the concept of having the right kind of space in the right locations to best facilitate employee communications and service to the public. We look for common needs, so the committee's recommendation is for the departments that support the elected officials and the internal enterprise be located in City Hall. Those who serve the public, both from a transactional and collaborative standpoint, be located near City Hall, and those who have operational support can remain downtown or be moved to a different location. We also reached out to our staff. About half of the respondents in city-owned buildings and leased spaces are dissatisfied with their current working environment. They desire a work environment that has access to quiet, private spaces to collaborate in. The need for conference space was high, but our conference room utilization is relatively low at 31%. 81% of our conferencing need is for 4 persons or less. Therefore, collaborative work is often done in an open office environment and can be highly distractive employees who need to do heads-down work. Noise interruption was a common complaint. Further study indicated that our conference room sizing did not match the need, as 90% of our conferencing need is for 6 persons or less, but only 24% of our conference room supply is of that size or nature. Often small groups schedule conference rooms that are larger than their needs, and alternately, rather than tying up a larger room than is needed, meetings are often conducted in inappropriate spaces. We also found differing perceptions based on age of the respondents. Workplace needs will continue to change over time. Therefore, our buildings and spaces need to be readily adaptable. As a result of the interviews, the functional adjacency studies, and our workplace surveys, it's become increasingly apparent that a solution for public safety would need to be addressed differently than general office space. Therefore, the recommendation will be to move the police, with the exception of the chief and her leadership team, out of City Hall. The higher needs for security and the nature of police and fire business are often an odd fit in an open civic nature that City Hall should be. We studied 2 scenarios for accomplishing this new driver. The first was a combined facility scenario, that is City Hall plus a combined facility where public safety and general office components would have separate entrances. A second scenario was studied was a concept of separate facilities, meaning City Hall plus a building for public safety and a separate building for general office needs. Additionally, both scenarios envision incorporating a new Fire Station 1 as a component. Either scenario was acceptable to the chief of police and fire. Each scenario was deemed viable. The end result of the recommendation is that do nothing is not an option, and consolidation of space would improve delivery of services to the public. Conducting business with the public should be made more easily accessible, be more comprehensive, and should be co-located with city departments that support it. Our task then moved on to bringing viable options forward for discussion and comparison. As stated earlier, do nothing is not an option, and making significant investment in facilities is needed at this time. So for a basis of comparison, we established as a baseline renovating our current buildings and continuing to lease for unmet space needs. All options assessed would provide for the space needs, but vary greatly in meeting our intended outcomes. This map shows the locations of options analyzed in their proximity to City Hall. Through a thorough review of market options near City Hall, we found that no other available privately owned buildings have the ability to meet the needs and/or fit the primary goals of an improved employee workplace, an improved public interface, or a cost-optimized consolidation solution. A consistent finding in large multi-tenant office buildings is none of them had sufficient public-facing space and were not set up for high-volume visitor traffic. In essence, our need to serve the public would be an odd fit in these buildings and that had adequate amounts of space. Although Skyway connected, proximity to City Hall was also an issue. Extensive study was given to these three options, but they were no longer either available or added complexity that made another option more viable. In summation, the Executive Committee's recommendation is for the city to construct a new building on our current government center parking site, ramp site. By doing so, we best meet our intended outcomes and will be freeing up key blocks for private development. This would be our projected schedule for implementation. And as part of today's recommendation, staff requests that we move forward on some key next steps. In order for this plan to move forward in a timely and organized manner, we recommend a dedicated project manager be hired, and we hire a consultant to further develop our program needs and assist in our scope development, cost estimating, so we can continue to make informed decisions. We further recommend that the Executive Committee remain engaged in this phase of the project to ensure proper vetting as we move forward. With that, Chair, I'll take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goki. Just a few minutes, you've summarized the work of 15 years, right?
Well, on and off.
Well, it's certainly a lot to get to this point, and some big decision points that have come along the way. I was, as we were talking about this over the last couple of years, there were some ideas that were considered in the past, but were certainly no longer available to us given the growth in the central business district. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, one of the options that we did look at was renovating the Public Service Center for the needs of police and fire, and then partnering with Ryan Construction on Block 68. Mm-hmm. But as that moved forward, Block 68, Ryan made a fundamental decision to move forward with that being their corporate headquarters in a multi-tenant building, which left not enough space to cover the city's needs. Mm-hmm. So it kind of came off the docket.
Yeah. Well, it was a pleasure to be on the steering committee, and I hope we can continue to do that work, because every time you move one piece of the puzzle, something else is affected. And it's a fascinating exercise, so I really applaud you and our consultants on this project, bringing forward several options. But it was something that is certainly based on serving the public's needs first, serving our employees' needs, consolidating and saving some money. And we are going to hopefully make some new development opportunities available if we're able to use property that we already own. So we're not taking anything off the property tax rolls. We're hopefully going to be adding to it. So I'm sure there's other questions along the way, so we'll begin. I think Council Vice President Glidden had the first question.
Thanks. So I am just looking at what's the actions that are requested for today. Mm-hmm. Authorizing issuance of requests for proposals for project management services, and then authorizing issuance of requests for proposals for program development services. And I wanted to know what kind of information you think that those that we're going to get from, I mean, what are you looking for that helps us refine this proposal? I know this isn't a proposal that yet talks about what it will cost. And as I understand from talking with staff, there's some pretty big variation in what could be the cost, probably depending on some strategic decisions on what's best for the city, what we can do or should do. And so I just need a little bit more from you on how you think these moving forward in this way will help us.
Chairman Quincy, committee members, and Councilmember Glidden, that is really the essence of what program development will help us with. So we know approximately the departments we'd like to put in a new facility, approximately their square footage that they need, where we would share spaces, where we would have the highest level of public interaction. I'm going to kind of describe that you can build a building that is just basically what I want to call a functional box that, you know, houses people and takes care of their basic needs, anything up to something that's a statement building, and that, you know, is clearly maybe a government building and has more higher level finishes on the outside of the building and so forth. So qualitative discussions we have not delved into in any great detail. Also, as we reach out to departments, there's a list of amenities that people are bringing forward that they would like to see. Some of those would support employees with young children. Some would support the health and welfare of our employees on site and so forth. And those have to be vetted against functional needs, overall cost of the building. And as we move forward, those decisions we feel would be best if we did have a representative group of elected officials involved at a detailed level. Also, when we get into the phase that would be after program development, then our design team that we would eventually hire and the construction team to build this potential facility would have a more solid base of facts that they were working over to meet the city's needs versus having to start from scratch. So we feel that money that we would spend in program development, we would gain the majority of that back in lower design fees from the architect and engineers.
So getting back to the Vice President's question here, program development service is sort of the first step. It's an assessment of what we need as a group, various departments, and that input.
It would take what we've collected to date and put it at a higher level of detail, and also would put a price tag to those individual line items or components, so we know when somebody asks for something, the magnitude of that request, and whether that could be fit into the overall affordability of what we're trying to accomplish here over time.
So how is that different than the project management services? Is that after that step?
The project management services are envisioned to guide us from today through the end of the project. So right now, a project of this size and nature would somewhat overwhelm the resources in my office. As an example, as we're trying to move forward and develop the East Side project, the Roof Depot property, the impound lot, and some other projects that are very important to municipal operations. So we're basically right now at staff capacity. And just like our projects that we've recently moved forward in the city, whether it be Nicollet Mall or the Commons and so forth, a dedicated person to channel all resources, decisions, contracts, so forth, from start to finish is needed for this size of project.
You have other questions, Councilman? Remember, or did that answer your question?
Yep. So I'll have one more question, which is just trying to understand a little bit more about how much space you think will be needed for combined facilities scenario, and how that compares to what's on that space today that the city owns. And I guess I'm not sure if we own more than just the parking facility on that block, or kind of what's the options that we're reviewing there.
Okay, in general, for the needs of public safety, which we're actually short on space now, we'd be looking at approximately 100,000 square foot for public safety, about 150,000 for coordinator and other activities. It would, or excuse me, not coordinator, but collaborative and transactional issues with the public. That's CPED, parts of public works, licensing, things like that. So we're looking at a building in the range of $250,000. Part of that is a determination of how much we build downtown, how much we might push to the field. An example, a solid waste and recycling. Folks who work on billing, customer service may go out to the field to be combined with the field operation or left downtown. So we do have some, that's program development, some of those decisions that can go either way. What's in the best interest of delivering the service will be a driver in that, as well as cost of building downtown versus building in the field. We own approximately 60% of the block. It is our parking structure. That parking structure is getting toward the end of its useful life. At some point in time, if we were continuing to operate it, we would have to put significant dollars into the facility. Salt and corrosion has gotten to the steel. The ramp is still certifiable as far as safety for the foreseeable future, but at some point, significant investment would need to be made. The remaining 40% of the block is another parking structure that is privately owned at this time. One of our challenges in design is, kind of the massing of the building. We probably don't need our entire owned parcel to do this. We would probably build more upright, which may give an opportunity for part of the parcel to be remained for maybe another development property or partnership with somebody else in the near neighborhood who may need some land and space as well.
Good. Thank you. Anyone else? One question I had, Mr. Yoki, was about the timing. What would be the soonest that we'd be looking at a construction or versus an outside? And would it go over multiple years for financing component, especially for these RFPs that we're about to issue? Would they be over multiple budget years?
To answer your question on timing for construction, as maybe what your question is, that we would be looking at not doing demolition of that parking ramp until the Super Bowl event had been conducted. We have plenty of planning activities and design activities to lead up with it to that time frame, and we would also then continue to operate and collect revenues from it as a parking facility. As far as the dollar amounts you have in front of you, the dollar amounts that I need to start these processes this year, I do have already in previous appropriations for this year. And Mark Ruff has, I've been working with him, and he is making sure as you move forward on approving 2017 budget that the monies that we need for 2017 will be part of that budget process decision.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure we're prepared for that. And we haven't allocated money that hasn't been spent yet, but I'm pleased to hear everything's on track and is going well. Are there any other questions, comments from committee members? Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Goki, just in very general terms, how much of this building would you expect to be offset by the other parcels that we would be releasing at the end of the entire project?
Well, the end of the entire project, and I'm hoping I understand your question, we would be moving everybody out of the Public Service Center, the City of Lakes, the Crown Roller Mill, the toll building. The idea would be consolidating everybody into a single building who would not be in City Hall or moved out to a field location where they would operate more efficiently.
So then the sale
I'm going to
price,
say with the exception of First Precinct. I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear. That will still be a standalone building.
So I think Councilmember Palmisano was looking for the financial component of that. How much of that would be rental leasing savings, and how much would we be able to secure possibly on the real estate market should we decide to go to that route? Will those funds be used as a way to recapture some of those expenses of building a central project?
We do plan on selling our owned real estate off. So Fire Station 1, Public Service Center, City of Lakes. We will be working with our Community Planning and Economic Development Department to determine whether that will just be a land and building sale or that will be a development activity in the future. I have had conversations with CPED, and they believe that the true economic gain is freeing those up for future development. and that would be the highest and best use of the land.
Thank you. So is it reasonable to think that at the end of all of this moving around, that this new development or changing the parking ramp to be all of these other things would be basically paid for by the kinds of selling and development projects we would do with these other spaces?
That would be very dependent on what type of development would be built and when it would come. And in my conversations with CPED and my understanding of how we do establish tax rates, there's a different tax rate for housing versus mixed or commercial development. So it really depends on the end result of that. Conservatively, they believe that the two parcels, what we own and what we would free up in Fire Station 1, assuming that block would move forward, or that half block, that they say conservatively they felt that the parcels in total would have $200 million of development potential.
Thank you.
And I'm going to answer your question a little bit too, is that there is a certain amount of investment we would have to make in our own buildings and continuing to lease that is significant to start with. And then the difference between that and consolidation and your better business model is not a significant dollar amount difference. Will all the taxation potential offset it? It really depends on what's going to come on those parcels.
Good. Very helpful. Thank you. Great question. Not seeing anything else. So, Ms. Ruff, do you look like you'd like to add a final thought?
Sure, Mr. Chair, addressing Councilmember Palmisano's question too, and just some clarifications, is ultimately underlying this is questions about what are going to be the costs of this project and what are our revenue sources and what are going to be the expenses. And I think it's our hope by issuing these RFPs that instead of just giving you round numbers today, we can come back to you before the end of calendar year 2016 with the work of the consultants that we're asking authority to hire, and be able to give you, here's what the narrow range of a cost of a building, here's what we're going to be losing in terms of parking revenues, here's what we're going to be gaining in terms of parking sales, and here are some options on how to pay for the structure. I want to emphasize that it's not going to be our recommendation that we have a big increase in the levy in 2017 to pay for this building. We have lots of options to consider, one of which is we have some bond issues which are going to be paid off over the next 5 or 6 years, which will free up some levy dollars which are currently used for debt service on other structures to help offset some of those costs. So I think that we want to take this in a thoughtful and judicious process and make sure that we're not either under-promising or over-promising in terms of what budgets are going to be and what the relative services are going to be then to the public incorporated with that. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't mean to be vague by any means, but I think it's important to emphasize that we're being open to all possibilities here and haven't just narrowed the scope and made a decision without appropriate input.
Good. Thank you very much, everybody. Seeing no further questions on this, I think this is our first action on a downtown space or downtown campus, although we've been talking about it for a number of years, and the terrific study session that we had last year. So with that, on the issuance of the 2 RFPs and the other related actions on this item, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed, and those carry. So thank you very much, Mr. Goki and the entire Finance Property Services team. Seeing no further business on this agenda, correct, we are adjourned.